Welcome back to Ellen's Werewolf Romance Collection. I'm so excited to share today's story with you. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video to support the stories you love. I'd love to see how far our pack reaches, so comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. Also, stay active in the comments as you listen. Call out your favorite parts and let's gush over the Alpha King together. Without further ado, here is The Crippled Girl said to the Alpha King, "Catch me if you can." In the ruthless hierarchy of the Black Ridge Pack, physical power is the only currency that matters. Maisie, a wolf who cannot shift and relies on a manual wheelchair she sarcastically calls the Silver Chariot, has spent her life being the ultimate underdog. While the rest of her kin bow in terror before the strikingly handsome and formidable King Bastion, Maisie chooses a different path. She refuses to be overlooked or underestimated. With a sharp tongue and a knack for high-speed maneuvers, she throws down a challenge that no one in the history of the Shifter Kingdoms has dared to utter to the Alpha of Alphas. This is a high-stakes game of wits and wheels where catching her is only the beginning of the King's problems. Chapter 1. The Squeak Herd. Round the pack. The granite citadel was a sprawling monument to ancestral pride and architectural inconvenience. For the members of the Black Ridge Pack, the fortress represented their unyielding strength and history of dominance. For Maisie, however, the citadel was simply a series of very expensive, very annoying obstacles designed to test the durability of her biceps and the bearings of her wheelchair. She navigated the narrow service corridors with the practiced ease of a professional racer, her hands moving in a rhythmic blur against the push rims of the Silver Chariot. The chair was a manual relic of chrome and black leather that she had tinkered with until it moved with a surprising, albeit noisy, efficiency. Every rotation of the wheels produced a high-pitched squeak that served as her unofficial theme song, announcing her arrival to anyone within a 50-yard radius. While the rest of the pack was currently preoccupied with polishing their furs and practicing their most submissive bows for the arrival of the Alpha King, Maisie was focused on a much more pressing matter: the scent of fresh lemon tarts wafting from the royal kitchens. She knew the layout of the citadel better than the architects did, mainly because she had spent years finding the secret ramps and flat passages that allowed her to bypass the grand, sweeping staircases that her kin loved so much. To the other wolves, she was a ghost in the machinery, a person they frequently forgot to include in their ceremonies and celebrations. They didn't see a threat in the girl who couldn't shift, and Maisie was more than happy to let them remain blissfully unaware of how much information she gathered while they ignored her presence in the corners of the room. The Great Alpha Convergence was supposed to be the event of the century, a gathering of the most powerful leaders in the shifter world to discuss treaties and, more importantly, to witness King Bastion's search for a suitable queen. The rumors about the king were as thick as the mountain fog. Some said he was 10 feet tall, while others claimed his growl alone could shatter glass. Maisie found the entire spectacle exhausting. In her mind, an alpha was just a man with a larger ego and a more expensive tailor. She didn't care about royal lineages or fated mates. She cared about the fact that the king's massive security detail was currently blocking the most direct route to the pastry larder. It was a logistical nightmare that required her to take a detour through the main gallery, a place she usually avoided during high traffic hours. As she rounded a sharp corner, leaning her body weight into the turn to keep the Silver Chariot on 2 wheels for a brief, exhilarating second, she nearly collided with a group of high-ranking she-wolves who were draped in silks and smelling of aggressive floral perfumes. They jumped back as if her wheelchair was a predatory beast, their faces twisting into expressions of pity and disdain. Maisie didn't give them the satisfaction of a frown. Instead, she popped a small wheelie, spinning her chair around them with a cheerful wink. She knew exactly what they thought of her, and she took a perverse pleasure in being the one element of chaos they couldn't control. They wanted a world of perfect, powerful warriors, but Maisie was a constant reminder that life was rarely that tidy or predictable. The atmosphere in the citadel shifted as the heavy oak doors of the main entrance began to groan open. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the hallway, the kind of silence that usually preceded a thunderstorm or a massive structural failure. Maisie felt the change in the air, a thick, electric pressure that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was the scent of cedar, cold rain, and something ancient and commanding. The king had arrived. She pulled her chair into the shadows of a large stone pillar, watching as the vanguard of the royal guard marched in with synchronized precision. They were followed by a man who didn't just walk into a room. He seemed to own the very air within it. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than the entire Blackridge treasury, and his presence was so overwhelming that even the most arrogant alphas in the room lowered their heads. King Bastian was younger than Maisie had expected, with features that looked like they had been carved from the very granite of the mountain. His eyes were a piercing, stormy gray, scanning the room with a look of profound boredom. He looked like a man who had everything and was impressed by absolutely nothing. As he moved down the receiving line, accepting the desperate flattery of the pack elders, Maisie found herself leaning forward, her curiosity getting the better of her. She watched the way he moved, noting the coiled power in his limbs and the way he seemed to tolerate the world rather than enjoy it. He was a king in search of a queen, but his expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. Just as the king reached the center of the gallery, the silver chariot decided it was the perfect time to betray her. A small pebble, likely brought in by the boots of the guards, caught in her front caster wheel. The sudden resistance combined with Maisie's forward lean sent a sharp metallic clack echoing through the silent hall. To anyone else it was a minor noise, but in the vacuum of the king's arrival, it sounded like a gunshot. Bastian's head snapped toward the pillar where Maisie was perched, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, sharp intensity. For the first time in her life, Maisie felt the full weight of an alpha's gaze, and for a terrifying second, she forgot how to breathe. Instead of shrinking back, however, the familiar spark of rebellion ignited in her chest. She realized that every single person in the room was staring at her with horror, waiting for the king to smite the girl who had dared to interrupt his grand entrance. The absurdity of the situation hit her like a wave, and a small, defiant smile played at the corners of her mouth. She didn't bow, and she didn't apologize. She simply adjusted her grip on the wheels of her chair, her eyes never leaving the king's face. The silence stretched, becoming so heavy it was almost physical, until Bastian took a single, deliberate step toward her, his expression unreadable and his intent unknown. Chapter 2. Parking Violations. The tension in the great gallery was thick enough to choke a grizzly. Every shifter in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the sky to fall or for King Bastian to unleash a roar that would bring the rafters down. Maisie felt the heat of 100 judgmental stares boring into her back, but she kept her gaze fixed on the man approaching her. Bastian moved with a predatory grace that made the heavy stone floor seem like a mere suggestion. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the silver chariot, his towering frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. Up close, the scent of him was even more overwhelming. A mixture of ancient forests and expensive leather that made her heart do a frantic little dance against her ribs. Bastian didn't speak immediately. He tilted his head, his stormy eyes raking over the dents in her wheelchair and the grease stains on her fingertips. It was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. Maisie realized that her silence was probably being interpreted as fear, which was a misunderstanding she needed to correct immediately. She cleared her throat, the sound echoing loudly in the stillness. She was supposed to be heading toward the kitchens for those lemon tarts, and this brooding mountain of a man was currently the biggest obstacle in her path. The king finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very wheels of her chair. He asked if she realized who he was. The question was framed with the calm arrogance of someone who had never been questioned in his life. Maisie didn't blink. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms over her chest. She told him that unless he was the new delivery man for the bakery, he was currently standing in a designated parking zone and was dangerously close to receiving a citation. A collective gasp went up from the surrounding pack members. The elders looked like they were on the verge of a synchronized fainting spell. Bastian's eyes narrowed, but instead of the explosion everyone expected, a flicker of something that looked dangerously like amusement passed through his expression. He took another step forward, closing the gap until the tips of his polished boots were inches away from her footrests. He told her that no one had ever mentioned the Black Ridge Pack possessed such a fierce guardian of the hallways. Maisie gave him a sharp, toothy grin. She informed him that most people were too busy bowing to notice the girl who actually kept the place running, but she didn't have time for a royal interview because the pastries were getting cold. Before he could respond, Maisie gripped the push rims of her wheels with everything she had. She intended to make a grand, sweeping exit, but the aforementioned pebble was still wedged in her caster. When she shoved forward, the chair didn't move in a straight line. Instead, the silver chariot jerked violently to the left. The metal footrest swung out like a battering ram and collided directly with the king's shin with a loud, hollow thud. The sound of metal meeting bone was sickeningly clear in the silent room. Bastian didn't move an inch, but his jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might crack. Maisie froze, her hands still tight on the wheels. She looked down at his ruined suit trousers and then up at his face, which had gone remarkably pale. For a second, she genuinely thought this might be the moment she was exiled to the frozen tundras. The guards took a step forward, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Bastian raised a single hand to stop them. He didn't take his eyes off Maisie. The silence stretched again, vibrating with a new, dangerous energy. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a spark of intense, confusing chemistry that neither of them seemed prepared for. She decided that the best defense was a ridiculous offense. She looked him dead in the eye and told him that she had warned him about the parking violation. She added that his shins were clearly in the way of her royal right-of-way and that he should probably see a doctor about his lack of situational awareness. Bastian let out a breath that was half growl and half laugh, a sound so unexpected it made the beta standing behind him stumble. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and told her that she was the most troublesome creature he had encountered in a century. He whispered that she should be careful, or he might decide to make her his personal shadow just to see what else she was capable of hitting. Maisie didn't wait for a rebuttal. She yanked the chair backward, dislodging the pebble with a sharp snap, and spun around with practiced precision. She sped away down the corridor, the squeak of her wheels providing a frantic rhythm to her retreat. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire way. She reached the safety of the kitchen doors, her heart hammering against her chest like a trapped bird. She had just assaulted the king of the wolves and lived to tell the tale, but as she reached for a lemon tart, she had the sinking feeling that the chase had only just begun. Chapter 3. The King's New Shadow. The morning following the shin incident found Maisie in a state of high alert. She had spent the night dreaming of stormy gray eyes and the sound of metal hitting expensive leather, waking up with a restless energy she couldn't quite shake. She knew the palace gossip mill was currently churning at maximum capacity. By breakfast, the story of the girl in the chair who had humbled the king would be told and retold until she was a folk hero or a villain. Maisie preferred to stay out of the spotlight, so she decided that today was the perfect day to explore the dusty, neglected corners of the West Wing, where the royal guests rarely ventured. She spent hours navigating the narrow servant passages, enjoying the solitude and the way the morning light filtered through the high, arched windows. She was busy contemplating whether she could rig a small motor to the silver chariot using some spare parts from the forge, when a familiar, heavy scent filled the air. It was that same combination of cedar and rain. She didn't even have to turn around to know who was standing at the end of the hall. She sighed, her hands tightening on the wheels. She told the empty air that the king must be truly desperate for entertainment if he was spending his royal vacation stalking a girl in a wheelchair. Bastian stepped out from the shadows of a heavy velvet curtain, looking entirely too smug for a man who had been hit by a wheelchair less than 24 hours ago. He didn't seem bothered by her remark. He told her that he found her tactical maneuvers far more interesting than the endless parade of sycophants in the ballroom. He began to walk toward her, his pace slow and deliberate, matching the speed she usually maintained when she was just cruising. Maisie picked up the pace, her wheels spinning faster as she headed toward a sharp corner. She wasn't in the mood for a heart-to-heart with a man who could probably snap her chair in half with one hand. Every time she turned a corner or ducked into a side room, Bastian was there. He didn't try to stop her, and he didn't call out to her. He simply followed, a silent, massive presence that refused to be ignored. It was infuriating. Maisie tried every trick in her book. She zipped through a narrow doorway that was barely wide enough for her frame, hoping he would find it too cramped. He simply shifted his shoulders and walked through with an effortless grace that made her want to throw something at him. She tried to lose him in the labyrinth of the library, weaving between the towering mahogany shelves, but the man had the tracking skills of a bloodhound. Finally, she pulled to a stop in the center of the conservatory, the glass walls reflecting the bright afternoon sun. She spun her chair around to face him, her eyes sparking with annoyance. She asked him if he had a license for following people, or if this was just a hobby for kings who didn't have enough paperwork to do. Bastian stopped a few feet away, leaning against a stone pillar with an air of casual dominance. He told her that he was simply ensuring that his favorite parking enforcer didn't get into any more accidents. The way he said favorite made a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a feeling she immediately tried to squash. He began to ask her about the silver chariot, his voice dropping the arrogant edge it usually carried. He wanted to know who had built it, and why she didn't use the enchanted versions favored by the southern packs. Maisie's expression hardened. She told him that she didn't need magic to get where she was going, and that her chair was a result of her own sweat and a lot of stolen oil from the forge. She explained that in a pack where everyone relied on their wolf forms to feel powerful, she preferred something that didn't require a full moon to function. It was a rare moment of honesty, and she immediately regretted it when she saw the look of profound respect in his eyes. Bastian moved closer, his presence suddenly feeling very large in the confined space of the conservatory. He told her that he had never met anyone who fought so hard to be independent in a world that demanded conformity. He reached out as if to touch the armrest of her chair, but Maisie pulled back, a defensive reflex she couldn't control. She wasn't used to people looking at her with anything other than pity or dismissal. The king's gaze was different. It was intense, focused, and saw her as a person rather than a problem to be solved. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. She decided it was time to end the encounter before she did something stupid, like let him see her blush. She told him that his flattery was about as effective as a blunt butter knife, and that she had things to do that didn't involve being analyzed by a royal guest. She spun the silver chariot around and headed for the exit, but as she reached the door, she looked back over her shoulder. Bastian was still standing by the pillar, watching her go with a look of quiet determination. She realized then that he wasn't going to stop. He wasn't just curious, he was hunting, and for the first time in her life, Maisie wasn't sure if she wanted to be caught. Chapter 4. Stairs are a personal insult. The third day of the king's visit brought a new challenge: the grand banquet. Every member of the Black Ridge Pack was required to attend, which meant Maisie had to find a way to get to the Great Hall without losing her mind or her dignity. The Great Hall was perched at the top of a magnificent marble staircase that the designers had clearly built to spite anyone with wheels. There was a service lift, but it was currently being used to haul up massive crates of wine and roasted meats, leaving Maisie with a difficult choice. She could wait for the lift and be late, or she could find another way. She was staring up at the stairs with a look of profound hatred when Bastian appeared at her side. He was dressed in traditional royal furs that made him look like a primitive warrior king, his dark hair slightly windswept. He looked at the stairs, and then at Maisie, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like concern. He offered to carry her, his voice low and sincere. He told her that it would be his honor to bring the most spirited member of the pack to the feast. Maisie felt a flash of white-hot anger. She didn't want his honor, and she certainly didn't want to be carried like a sack of royal potatoes. She turned to him, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheels of the silver chariot. She told him that she had spent her entire life navigating a world that wasn't built for her, and she wasn't about to start relying on a man who probably couldn't even find his own socks without a servant. She added that her chair was her legs, and if her legs couldn't go somewhere, then she didn't belong there. Bastian looked taken aback, his brow furrowed as he tried to understand her defiance. He told her that he wasn't trying to diminish her, but simply to help. Maisie informed him that help was often just a polite word for control. Without another word, she spun her chair around and headed toward the laundry wing. She knew the palace had a system of chutes used for moving heavy bundles of linens between floors. It was dangerous, highly discouraged, and exactly the kind of thing she excelled at. Bastian followed her, his confusion turning into alarm as he realized where she was heading. He told her that she couldn't possibly be serious about using a laundry chute to travel between floors. Maisie just gave him a reckless grin and told him to watch and learn. She reached the chute, which was essentially a wide wooden slide designed for frictionless travel. She lined the silver chariot up with the opening, her heart racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She knew that if she didn't hit the angle perfectly, she would end up as a heap of scrap metal at the bottom. Bastian reached out to grab the back of her chair, his voice urgent as he told her to stop. Maisie didn't listen. She gave him a mocking salute and shoved herself forward. The world turned into a blur of dark wood and the smell of lavender detergent. She felt the rush of wind against her face as she descended, her wheels spinning wildly in the air. It was a terrifying, beautiful moment of pure freedom. She hit the bottom with a jarring thud, landing on a massive pile of discarded tablecloths that softened the impact. She let out a shaky laugh, checking to make sure the silver chariot was still in one piece. Aside from a new scratch on the frame, she was perfectly fine. She straightened her hair and rolled out of the laundry room, emerging into the hallway just as Bastian came sprinting down the stairs, his face a mask of pure terror. He skidded to a stop when he saw her, his chest heaving as he stared at her in disbelief. He told her that she was officially insane, and that he was going to have a heart attack before the week was over. Maisie wiped a stray piece of lint off her shoulder and told him that he was just upset because she had beaten him to the floor. She pointed out that while he had been busy running down the stairs like a commoner, she had taken the Royal Express. Bastian stared at her for a long moment, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by a wild, burning admiration. He told her that he had never met a woman who made him feel so incredibly useless and so utterly fascinated at the same time. He walked over to her, his hand lingering just inches from hers, and told her that he was going to marry her even if he had to pave every road in the kingdom to do it. Maisie felt the air leave her lungs at his declaration. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a casual remark. The intensity in his voice was like a physical weight, making her realize that this was no longer a game of witty banter. He was serious. She looked at him, searching for any sign of mockery, but all she found was a steady, unwavering heat. She told him that he was getting ahead of himself and that she hadn't even given him her phone number yet. She rolled past him toward the great hall, but her hands were shaking. The cliffhanger of her life was looming, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the fall. Chapter 5. The Grumpy King's Investigation. The morning after her great laundry escape, the citadel was buzzing with a new energy. King Bastian had disappeared into his private chambers with his beta, Valerius, and a stack of records that hadn't been touched in decades. Maisie spent her morning in the forge, trying to ignore the way her stomach flipped every time she thought about his marriage proposal. She told herself it was just the alpha ego talking. A man used to getting what he wanted, deciding he wanted the only girl who wouldn't give it to him. She worked on tightening the bolts on her footrests, the rhythmic clinking of her tools providing a distraction from her racing thoughts. Meanwhile, in the Royal Solar, Bastian was staring at a faded medical report from 12 years ago. He had ordered Valerius to find everything related to Maisie's history, much to the Beta's confusion. Valerius pointed out that the king should be focusing on the diplomatic treaties with the North, not the medical history of a low-ranking pack member. Bastian ignored him. He was reading about a young girl who had been caught in a rogue attack, a girl who had protected her younger siblings at the cost of her own ability to shift. The report described her as broken and useless to the pack's defense. Bastian's grip on the parchment tightened until the paper began to tear. He looked up at Valerius, his eyes dark with a cold, simmering fury. He asked how a pack could call a hero broken just because her sacrifice had left her in a chair. Valerius shifted uncomfortably, explaining that the Black Ridge pack had always valued physical perfection above all else. It was their way, their tradition. Bastian threw the parchment onto the table, telling his beta that their traditions were a disgrace to the shifter name. He realized that Maisie hadn't just been fighting the environment. She had been fighting a culture that told her she didn't exist. Her sarcasm wasn't just a personality trait, it was a shield. He spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the room, his mind working through 1,000 different plans. He wanted to give her the world, but he knew that if he tried to hand it to her, she would probably throw it back in his face. She didn't want charity, and she certainly didn't want to be a project. She wanted to be seen. He thought back to the way her eyes lit up when she was challenging him, the way she moved the silver chariot with such fierce pride. He realized that to win her heart, he had to stop trying to be her protector and start being her equal. He had to show her that he didn't want a queen who could run beside him in the woods. He wanted the queen who would make him run to keep up. As evening approached, the palace prepared for the great garden party. It was a more relaxed event, held in the ancient stone gardens where the moonlight could illuminate the blooming night flowers. Bastian knew this was his chance. He dressed with care, choosing a simpler tunic that allowed him more freedom of movement. He told Valerius to ensure that the paths in the garden were cleared of any debris, and that the guards stayed at a respectful distance. He wasn't going as a king tonight. He was going as a man who had finally found the missing piece of his soul. Maisie was already in the garden, hiding behind a large fountain to avoid the group of gossiping she-wolves who were currently debating which of them the king would dance with first. She was munching on a piece of stolen honeycomb, enjoying the cool night air. She heard the familiar, steady tread of his boots long before he reached her. She didn't turn around, simply telling him that he was late for his own party, and that the gossips were starting to get restless. Bastian sat down on the edge of the fountain beside her, his presence calm and grounding. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching the moonlight dance on the water. He finally spoke, asking her if she knew that the garden was the only place in the citadel that was perfectly flat. Maisie looked at him, surprised by the observation. She admitted that it was the only reason she liked the place. Bastian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told her that he had spent the afternoon learning about her past, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to see her. Maisie felt a surge of defensiveness, telling him that she didn't want his pity. Bastian shook his head, his eyes burning with sincerity. He told her it wasn't pity, it was awe. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a horn, signaling the start of the evening's festivities. The pack members were gathering in the center of the garden, their eyes searching for the king. Bastian stood up, offering his hand to Maisie. She looked at it for a long moment, her heart pounding. She didn't take it, but she didn't pull away either. She told him that he was making a scene. Bastian laughed, a deep, joyful sound that made several people turn around in shock. He told her that he was just getting started. He challenged her to a race to the center of the garden, the winner getting to choose the next topic of conversation. Maisie's eyes sparked with a sudden competitive fire. She told him he was on, and as she gripped her wheels, she realized the stakes were higher than a simple conversation. Chapter 6. The King's Investigation. The morning after the laundry chute incident, the granite citadel felt like a pressure cooker waiting to whistle. While Maisie was busy in the lower levels trying to buff a new scuff mark off the silver chariot, King Bastian was sequestered in the royal library. He had spent the early hours of the dawn surrounded by ancient scrolls and dusty census records of the Black Ridge Pack. His beta, Valerius, stood by the window, watching the king with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. Bastian wasn't looking for political alliances or land boundaries. He was searching for the history of a girl who shouldn't have been a mystery. He wanted to know why the strongest wolves in the territory treated one of their own like a phantom. Bastian's fingers traced the ink on a parchment that dated back 12 years. It was a report of a rogue skirmish on the western border, a brutal night where several families had been caught in the crossfire. His eyes narrowed as he read the name of a young girl who had stayed behind to lure 3 rogue wolves away from a nursery. She had been found hours later, her legs crushed under the weight of a fallen stone monument, but every child she had protected was alive. The report ended with a cold, clinical note stating that the girl was no longer capable of shifting and would likely be a drain on pack resources. There was no mention of a medal, no record of a ceremony, and certainly no mention of the heroism that had cost her everything. The fury that surged through Bastian was unlike anything he had felt in decades. He had spent his life leading warriors who valued scars earned in battle. Yet here was a pack that discarded its bravest soul because she didn't fit their narrow definition of a predator. He closed the scroll with a snap that echoed through the vaulted room like a whip. He looked at Valerius and commanded him to bring the local alpha to the solar immediately. He didn't want a polite discussion about trade routes. He wanted to see the man who had allowed a hero to be treated as a shadow. When the local alpha arrived, he was preening, clearly under the impression that the king wanted to discuss a promotion for his eldest son. His smile faltered when he saw the expression on Bastian's face. The king didn't offer a seat or a greeting. Instead, he dropped the 12-year-old report onto the table and asked why the girl mentioned in the text was currently residing in the servants' quarters. The local alpha stammered, claiming that they had provided for her and that it was unfortunate she was so limited in her contributions. He used words like liability and useless, with a casualness that made Bastian's inner wolf snarl at the back of his throat. Bastian stepped into the man's personal space, his presence so massive that the other alpha actually stumbled back against the door. He informed the man that the only liability in the Black Ridge Pack was a leadership that couldn't recognize a true warrior when she was sitting right in front of them. He declared that from this moment forward, Maisie was under royal protection and that any wolf who spoke a word of disrespect toward her would answer directly to the king. The local alpha turned a pale shade of gray, nodding frantically as he realized the political nightmare he had just inherited. While the king was busy uprooting years of pack prejudice, Maisie was in her workshop, blissfully unaware of the storm being brewed in her name. She was focused on the front casters of her chair, which had developed an annoying rattle after her high-speed descent. She didn't need a king to defend her, and she certainly didn't need a savior. But as she worked, she found herself thinking about the way Bastian had looked at her in the conservatory. He didn't see a broken girl. He saw a challenge. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her with an intensity that had nothing to do with pity. It was a terrifying realization that made her wrench slip, skinning her knuckle and leaving a smudge of grease on her cheek. She heard the heavy thud of the library doors opening upstairs and the frantic scurry of servants. Something was happening in the palace, and she had a feeling the king was at the center of it. She didn't like being the subject of someone's investigation, but as she tightened the final bolt on the silver chariot, a small rebellious part of her wondered what it would be like to have someone as powerful as Bastian on her side. She shook the thought away, telling herself that kings were temporary and wheelchairs were forever. She had survived 12 years of being ignored. She could survive a few days of royal attention. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the stone floors, Bastian stood on the balcony of the library. He watched as Maisie emerged into the courtyard below, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she navigated the uneven cobblestones. He didn't call out to her, and he didn't try to stop her. He simply watched, his heart heavy with a protective instinct he had never truly understood until now. He had the information he wanted, but he knew that simply commanding the pack to respect her wasn't enough. He had to show them, and more importantly, he had to show her, that he was someone worth running with. Chapter 7. Catch Me If You Can. The Grand Garden Gala was the crown jewel of the Alpha Convergence, an event where the air was thick with the scent of competition and expensive champagne. Every eligible female shifter in the surrounding territories had arrived in their finest silks, their scents amplified to attract the king's attention. The garden was lit by thousands of floating lanterns that cast a soft, golden glow over the manicured hedges and marble statues. Maisie sat on the fringes of the party, her manual wheelchair tucked neatly into the shadow of a weeping willow. She had worn her best tunic, which was still just a simple cotton garment, but she had polished the chrome of the silver chariot until it shone like a mirror. She watched with a cynical smirk as the noblewomen paraded in front of Bastian, each one more desperate than the last to show off their strength or their lineage. Bastian looked like he was suffering through a particularly long and boring lecture. He stood on the raised dais, his expression a mask of royal indifference, until his eyes scanned the crowd and found the girl hiding under the willow tree. He didn't care about the silks or the scents. He cared about the girl who was currently eating a handful of pilfered shrimp and looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Bastian stepped down from the dais, ignoring the gasp of the crowd as he bypassed the line of suitors. He walked straight toward the shadows, his cape billowing behind him like a dark cloud. The music seemed to falter as the guests realized where he was heading. Maisie didn't move as he approached. She simply popped the tail of a shrimp into her mouth and watched him with a raised eyebrow. When he stopped in front of her, the silence was so profound that she could hear the gentle lap of the fountain nearby. He didn't ask for a dance. He simply told her that she looked like she was planning an escape. Maisie laughed, the sound bright and irreverent in the stiff atmosphere of the gala. She told him that she wasn't planning an escape. She was planning a heist, and that the dessert table was her primary target. She added that his presence was currently ruining her cover, and that he should probably go back to his adoring fans before they started throwing their tiaras at her. Bastian didn't leave. He leaned down, placing a hand on the back of her chair, and told her that he found the dessert table much less interesting than the girl currently guarding the shrimp. The proximity was intoxicating, and Maisie felt a flush creeping up her neck that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The crowd began to whisper, the sound like a swarm of angry bees. A high-ranking she-wolf, emboldened by wine and jealousy, stepped forward, and loudly remarked that it was a shame the king was wasting his time with someone who couldn't even stand to greet him properly. The insult hung in the air, cold and sharp. Maisie felt the familiar sting of it, but before she could sharpen her tongue for a retort, she felt the temperature around Bastian drop by 20 degrees. His hand tightened on her chair, his knuckles turning white as he looked at the woman with a gaze that could have turned water to ice. Maisie didn't want him to defend her. She wanted to defend herself. She put a hand on his arm, feeling the corded muscle beneath his sleeve, and gave him a small shake of her head. She looked at the woman and told her that standing was a bit overrated, especially when you could travel at 20 miles per hour without even breaking a sweat. She turned her attention back to Bastian, her eyes sparking with a sudden wild idea. She was tired of the whispers and the pity. If the king wanted a queen who could keep up with him, she was going to show him exactly what that looked like on her terms. She gripped the wheels of the silver chariot and spun around so she was facing the main garden path, a long paved stretch of marble that led toward the forest. She looked over her shoulder at Bastian, a daring, mischievous grin lighting up her face. She told him that he had been following her like a lost puppy for 3 days, claiming he wanted to understand her. She threw down the ultimate challenge, her voice ringing out clearly for everyone to hear. She told him that if he was truly the fastest wolf in the kingdom, he should prove it. She winked and yelled, "You're a bit slow on the uptake, Your Majesty. Catch me if you can." Before he could even process the words, Maisie shoved off with a burst of strength that made the wheels of her chair chirp against the marble. She leaned her chest toward her knees, her arms moving in a powerful, rhythmic stroke that sent her flying down the path. The silver chariot lived up to its name, gleaming under the lanterns as she disappeared into the darkness of the garden. The guests stood in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open as they watched a girl in a manual wheelchair challenge the Alpha King to a race. It was the most disrespectful, insane, and brilliant thing any of them had ever witnessed. Chapter 8. Repeat that again. Bastian stood frozen on the path for a heartbeat, the words, "Catch me if you can," echoing in his mind like a war cry. He had spent his entire life being the one who dictated the terms of every engagement, the one who moved first and asked questions later. To be challenged so openly and with such delightful insolence was a shock to his system that felt like a bolt of lightning. He watched the red light of the reflectors on the back of Maisie's chair vanish around a curve in the hedge maze, and a low, rumbling sound began to build in his chest. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was a laugh that had been bottled up for years. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He didn't want the unfair advantage of 4 legs and supernatural speed. He wanted to chase her as a man, to feel the burn in his lungs and the wind in his hair as he tried to keep up with the whirlwind on wheels. He took off at a sprint, his boots pounding against the marble with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Behind him, he could hear the chaos of the gala as the guests scrambled to follow. But he didn't care about them. His world had narrowed down to the squeak of a wheel and the sound of a girl's laughter drifting through the night air. Maisie was a professional when it came to the palace grounds. She knew every dip, every smooth patch of stone, and every corner where she could use her momentum to drift. She navigated the hedge maze with a speed that would have been impossible for anyone else, using her hands to pull herself around tight turns and her body weight to balance on 2 wheels. She could hear Bastian behind her, his footsteps getting closer, and the thrill of the chase made her adrenaline spike. She wasn't just running from a king. She was running toward a version of herself that didn't care about being broken. Bastian rounded the final corner of the maze and saw her heading toward the stone bridge that crossed the lily pond. She was a streak of chrome and determination, her arms moving with a strength that most shifters would have envied. He pushed himself harder, his heart hammering against his ribs. He managed to close the gap as she reached the center of the bridge, his longer stride finally giving him the edge. He lunged forward, not to grab her, but to block her path. He skidded to a stop in front of her, his chest heaving as he stared at her with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. Maisie slammed on her brakes, the tires of the silver chariot leaving black streaks on the white stone. She stopped inches from his legs, her face flushed and her eyes bright with triumph. She was gasping for air, her hair falling out of its simple tie and framing her face in a wild halo. She looked at him and laughed, telling him that he was out of breath and that she had clearly won the first leg of the race. She was leaning forward, her hands still resting on the wheels, looking like she was ready to take off again at the slightest provocation. The king stepped closer, his shadow falling over her as he leaned down. His face was inches from hers, and the intensity in his stormy eyes was enough to make the stars go dim. He didn't look like a king who had been insulted. He looked like a man who had finally found the only treasure worth keeping. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the air between them, thick with a possessive, heated energy. He told her that he had never had to work so hard for a conversation in his life. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of grease off her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. He asked her to say it again. He wanted to hear the challenge one more time, to make sure he hadn't imagined the fire in her voice. Maisie felt the world around them fall away, leaving only the two of them on the bridge. The sarcasm that usually protected her felt flimsy and unnecessary in the face of his honesty. She looked up at him, her heart doing a frantic somersault, and whispered the words that had started the madness. She told him that he was slow on the uptake, and that he should catch her if he could. She expected him to laugh or to argue, but instead, he did something much more dangerous. Bastian leaned in even further, his forehead resting against hers. He told her to repeat that again, but this time, he said it as a promise. He told her that he was going to catch her, and when he did, he was never going to let her go. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life chasing her through every garden, every hallway, and every kingdom, if that's what it took to keep her by his side. The cliffhanger of the moment was palpable, a tension so thick it felt like the entire world was waiting for her answer. Before she could speak, the sound of the approaching crowd broke the spell, leaving Maisie staring at the king with a realization that would change everything. Chapter 9. The Great Corridor, Chase. The morning after the bridge confrontation, the Granite Citadel was in a state of absolute hysteria. The guests from the gala were still whispering about the king's public display of affection, and the pack elders were holding emergency meetings to discuss the scandal. Maisie, however, was currently engaged in the most important mission of her life, getting to the kitchen before the breakfast rush. She knew that Bastian would be looking for her, and she wasn't quite ready to face the intensity of his promises just yet. She needed time to think, and more importantly, she needed a very large cup of coffee. She was halfway down the main corridor when she heard the unmistakable sound of royal boots clicking against the floor. She didn't even have to look back to know it was him. She groaned, leaning into her wheels and picking up speed. She told the empty hallway that the man had more energy than a pack of puppies, and that he really needed a hobby that didn't involve stalking her. She ducked into a side passage, hoping to lose him in the labyrinth of the servant quarters, but Bastian was persistent. He called out to her, his voice full of a playful authority that made her want to both laugh and scream. The chase moved from the main floor to the upper galleries, a high-speed game of cat and mouse that had the palace staff pressing themselves against the walls to avoid being run over. Maisie used every trick she knew. She zipped under a heavy tapestry. She used a narrow service ramp to bypass a set of stairs, and she even performed a daring drift around a corner that nearly took out a vase from the Third Dynasty. Bastian followed her every move, his longer legs allowing him to keep pace despite her head start. He was grinning like a madman, his usual stoic mask completely gone. As they reached the long gallery that overlooked the training grounds, Maisie realized she was running out of hallway. She looked back and saw Bastian only a few feet behind her, his eyes locked on her with a predatory glint. She decided to try one last desperate maneuver. She headed straight for the large open windows at the end of the hall, which were currently being cleaned by a group of terrified Omegas. She didn't slow down, aiming the silver chariot for the narrow gap between the cleaning buckets. She heard Bastian yell her name in alarm, but she just laughed and tucked her elbows in. She shot through the gap with a fraction of an inch to spare, her wheels splashing through a puddle of soapy water and sending a spray of bubbles into the air. She used the momentum to spin her chair around, coming to a stop at the very edge of the gallery railing. She looked back at Bastian, who had skidded to a halt just in front of the buckets, his hair covered in soap suds and his expensive tunic looking a bit worse for wear. She told him that he was getting sloppy, and that he should probably watch where he was going before he ended up in a bucket of lemon-scented floor wax. Bastian wiped a glob of soap from his forehead, looking down at his ruined clothes, and then at the girl who was currently laughing at his expense. He didn't look angry. He looked absolutely smitten. He walked toward her, his footsteps squelching slightly, and told her that he had never been humiliated by a cleaning supply before. He reached the railing and leaned against it, looking out over the training grounds where his warriors were watching them with wide eyes. He told her that she was the most dangerous person in the Citadel, and that he was starting to think he needed a bodyguard to protect him from her. Maisie felt the familiar heat rising in her chest again. She told him that his bodyguard wouldn't be able to keep up with her either, and that he should just accept his defeat gracefully. Bastian turned to her, his expression becoming serious for a moment. He told her that he didn't mind losing if it meant he got to spend his days chasing her. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. He told her that he had spent his life winning battles that didn't matter, and that for the first time, he was fighting for something that actually had a heart. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a loud, indignant throat clearing. Valerius was standing at the end of the hall, looking at the soap-covered king with an expression of profound disapproval. He informed Bastian that the delegates from the Northern Pack had arrived and that they were expecting a king, not a man who looked like he had been attacked by a bubble bath. Bastian sighed, giving Maisie a wink before he stood up and straightened his tunic. He told her that the chase wasn't over and that he would see her at dinner. Maisie watched him go, her heart feeling like it was trying to escape her ribcage. She had a feeling that no matter how fast she went, she wouldn't be able to outrun what was coming next. Chapter 10. WD-40 and Rose Petals. The following morning, Maisie woke up to find a strange package sitting outside her bedroom door. It was wrapped in heavy brown paper and tied with a silk ribbon that looked suspiciously like the one Bastian had been wearing at the gala. She pulled it into her room, her curiosity getting the better of her. Inside, she found a large, ornate bottle of high-grade, industrial-strength lubricant and a bouquet of red roses that were so fragrant they made her sneeze. There was a small note attached, written in a bold, masculine hand. It simply said, "For the silver chariot's voice and for the driver's heart, I'll be listening for the squeak." She couldn't help but laugh, the sound echoing through her small room. The king was actually courting her with WD-40. It was the most ridiculous, thoughtful, and hilarious gift she had ever received. She spent the next hour carefully applying the lubricant to the bearings of her wheels, noting with a smirk that the annoying squeak she had lived with for years was finally gone. The silver chariot now moved with a silent, lethal grace that felt like a brand-new toy. She tucked one of the roses behind her ear and headed out into the palace, feeling a strange new confidence in her step, or rather, her role. As she moved through the hallways, she noticed that the atmosphere had shifted yet again. The servants who usually ignored her were now bowing, and the guards were stepping aside with a level of respect they usually reserved for royalty. It seemed the king's declaration of protection had finally trickled down through the ranks. Maisie didn't quite know how to handle the sudden attention. She preferred being the ghost in the machinery, the one who could gather secrets without being noticed. Now, she was the center of the palace's universe, and she wasn't sure if she liked the view from the pedestal. She found Bastian in the courtyard, where he was supervising the training of the younger wolves. He looked up when she approached, his eyes immediately finding the rose behind her ear. He dismissed the trainees with a wave of his hand and walked toward her, his stride confident and steady. He asked her if the chariot was running more smoothly now. Maisie did a quick, silent spin to demonstrate, telling him that she was now a silent assassin, and that he should be very careful when walking down dark hallways. Bastian laughed, a sound that made the nearby guards jump in surprise. He told her that he had a surprise for her, something that didn't involve cleaning supplies or flowers. He led her toward the royal stables, where a group of craftsmen were working on a carriage. But as they got closer, Maisie realized it wasn't a carriage at all. It was a small, sleek vehicle made of lightweight titanium and dark wood, with wheels that looked like they had been designed for a racing chariot. Bastian explained that he had commissioned the royal smiths to create a new, silver chariot, one that was light enough for her to lift with one hand and strong enough to withstand a wolf's charge. Maisie stared at the new chair, her breath catching in her throat. It was beautiful, a work of art that acknowledged her needs without treating her like a patient. But as she looked at it, a wave of conflict washed over her. She looked at her old, dented manual chair and then back at the king. She told him that she appreciated the gesture, but that her old chair had been through every battle with her for 12 years. She said that you don't just replace a partner because a shiny new one comes along. Bastian's expression softened, and he told her that he should have expected nothing less from a woman of her loyalty. He told her that the new chair would be there whenever she was ready for it, but that in the meantime, he had another idea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, enchanted stone that glowed with a soft blue light. He explained that it was a heater, designed to keep her hands warm during the long mountain winters. He tucked it into the pocket of her tunic, his hand lingering for a moment against her side. He told her that he wasn't trying to change her or her chair. He just wanted to make the world a little bit easier for her to conquer. Maisie felt a lump in her throat that she couldn't swallow. No one had ever cared about her comfort before, let alone her conquests. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and told him that he was being suspiciously nice for an alpha king. Bastian leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper. He told her that he wasn't being nice, he was being honest. He said that he wanted to be the one who kept her hands warm, and the one who cleared her path, but only if she would let him. The cliffhanger of the moment was heavy with the weight of her choice. She wasn't just choosing a chair or a gift, she was choosing a future she had never dared to imagine. Chapter 11. The Pit Crew Strategy. The workshop in the bowels of the granite citadel smelled of ozone, pine resin, and the metallic tang of high-grade axle grease. Maisie sat in the center of the room, surrounded by her best friend Pip, and an assortment of parts that looked like they belonged on a high-speed racing carriage rather than a manual wheelchair. Pip was a lanky, fast-talking shifter who had never quite mastered the intimidating wolf aesthetic, preferring to spend his time tinkering with gears and gossip. He was currently upside down, his legs dangling off a workbench as he tightened a series of experimental bearings into the silver chariot's rear axle. He muttered about torque and friction, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. Maisie was busy sewing a reinforced leather pouch onto the side of her seat, a custom snack compartment she had dubbed the Larder of Doom. She explained to Pip that if she was going to be chased by a king every other hour, she needed easy access to high-calorie sustenance. Pip laughed, his voice muffled by the wrench in his teeth, and told her that she was the only person in the history of the world who would treat an alpha king like a persistent stray dog. He pointed out that half the women in the pack would sell their souls to have Bastian look at them for 3 seconds, yet Maisie was focused on how to outrun him to the nearest tray of muffins. The Alpha Games were only a few days away, a brutal series of trials designed to showcase the physical superiority of the shifter bloodlines. To the rest of the pack, it was a time of glory. To Maisie, it was an annual reminder that the world viewed her as a spectator. But this year was different. With her newly lubricated wheels and Pip's engineering upgrades, she didn't just want to watch. She wanted to be the most disruptive presence the games had ever seen. She and Pip had spent the last hour mapping out the obstacle course, identifying the exact spots where the ground was smooth enough for her to perform what she called the tactical drifting maneuver. Pip pulled himself up, wiping a smear of black grease across his forehead. He proudly showed her a set of retractable spikes he had added to the inner rims of her wheels, explaining that they would provide extra grip on the grassy sections of the training field. He called them the King Stoppers, and suggested that if Bastian got too close, she could kick up enough dirt to blind him temporarily. Maisie gave him a high five, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of excitement and nerves. For the first time, she felt like she was preparing for a battle that she actually had a chance of winning, even if the weapons were just clever mechanics and a lot of attitude. The door to the workshop creaked open, and a shadow fell across the floor. Bastian stood there, his massive frame nearly filling the doorway. He looked at the chaos of the workshop, the scattered tools, the snacks, and the lanky shifter hanging off the workbench, and his expression softened into one of genuine curiosity. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply walked over and picked up a spare bearing, turning it over in his large hand. He asked if the silver chariot was undergoing its final preparations for the upcoming festivities. His voice was low and calm, lacking the typical alpha command that usually made everyone in the room drop to their knees. Pip froze, looking like he wanted to bolt for the nearest window, but Maisie just pointed at the wrench and told him to finish the job before His Royal Highness distracted him. Bastian sat down on a crate of spare bolts, looking entirely comfortable in the dusty environment. He told them that he had seen many war machines in his time, but none were as ingenious as what they were building here. He reached out and tapped the new snack pouch, asking if it was designed to carry secret messages or perhaps a peace offering. Maisie informed him that it was strictly for cookies and that peace was currently off the table until he learned to knock. Bastian smiled, a slow and dangerous thing that made Maisie's heart do a frantic backflip. He told her that he was looking forward to seeing her at the Alpha Games, and that he had a feeling she was going to be the most talked-about participant in the field. He didn't mock her or suggest she should sit in the royal box. He spoke to her like a fellow competitor. He stood up to leave, but before he reached the door, he looked back at the duo. He told Pip that if the chair failed at a crucial moment, the royal smiths would be having a very unpleasant conversation with him. As the king disappeared back into the hallway, Pip let out a breath that sounded like a deflating balloon. He looked at Maisie with wide, panicked eyes and told her that they were definitely going to be executed if they didn't win. Maisie just adjusted her rose-adorned hair and told him that the king didn't want to execute them. He wanted to see if they could actually beat him. She gripped the wheels of the newly upgraded silver chariot, feeling the power in the smooth movement. The games were coming, and she was ready to show the entire shifter world that being broken was just a matter of perspective. Chapter 12. The Unwelcome Guest. The pre-game banquet was a shimmering display of pack politics and high-fashion fur. The Great Hall was packed with shifters from 3 different territories, all of them vying for a moment of the Alpha King's time. Maisie found herself situated near the end of the long table, tucked between a group of boisterous scouts and a massive floral arrangement that kept dropping petals into her soup. She didn't mind the location. It gave her a perfect view of the room without forcing her to engage in the polite plastic conversations of the elite. She watched Bastian at the head of the table, looking regal and utterly bored by the woman seated to his right. Lady Vane was a high-ranking noble from the southern pack, a woman who radiated an aura of expensive perfume and sharp ambition. She had spent the entire evening loudly discussing her lineage and her prowess in her wolf form, clearly aiming for the title of Alpha Queen. Every few minutes, she would cast a disparaging look toward the end of the table where Maisie sat, her lip curling in a silent sneer. It was a classic mean girl routine that Maisie had seen 1,000 times, but tonight, Lady Vane seemed determined to take it a step further. She wanted a target to make herself look more impressive, and the girl in the chair was the easiest choice in the room. During a lull in the music, Lady Vane stood up, her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. She raised her glass in a mock toast, her voice cutting through the chatter with practiced precision. She remarked that it was so inspiring to see the Black Ridge pack being so charitable toward those who couldn't contribute to the hunt. She looked directly at Maisie and asked, with a voice dripping in false sweetness, if it was difficult for her to watch the others dance when her own legs were so ornamental. The room went silent. Even the scouts next to Maisie stopped chewing their meat, their eyes darting between the noblewoman and the girl in the wheelchair. Maisie felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but before she could open her mouth, she felt a sudden, heavy pressure in the air. Bastian had stopped eating. He didn't stand up, and he didn't raise his voice, but the entire hall seemed to darken as his focus shifted toward Lady Vane. The silence became physical, a suffocating weight that made the noblewoman's smile falter. Bastian looked at her with eyes that were as cold as a mountain winter, and he asked her to repeat herself. The words were quiet, but they carried the force of a landslide. Lady Vane stammered, trying to backpedal, but the king wasn't finished. He stood up, his height making everyone else in the room feel small. He told the assembly that strength was not measured by the ability to run on 4 legs, but by the courage to face a world that tried to hold you back. He looked over the crowd until he found Maisie, his expression softening into something so intense it made her lungs seize. He told the room that he found Maisie's ornamental presence to be the most captivating thing in the palace. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he stepped away from the head table and began walking toward the end of the hall. He stopped in front of Maisie, ignoring the confused whispers of the elders. He didn't offer her a dance, nor did he offer a platitude. Instead, he leaned down, his face close to hers, and asked if she would be willing to give him driving lessons after the banquet. He told her that he had spent his life running, but he had never learned how to navigate a room with such devastating style and speed. The humor in his voice was clear, a deliberate slap in the face to Lady Vane's cruelty. He was telling the world that he would rather learn from Maisie than lead with anyone else. Maisie felt a wave of triumph wash over her, her lips curving into a slow, satisfied smirk. She looked at Lady Vane, who was now a very interesting shade of crimson, and then back at Bastian. She told him that her hourly rate was quite high, and that she didn't think a king could afford her expertise. Bastian laughed, a loud and genuine sound that shattered the tension in the room. He told her that he was prepared to pay whatever price she demanded, even if it meant giving her the keys to the royal pastry larder. He stayed by her side for the rest of the night, turning the banquet into a masterclass in how to ruin a rival's social standing without ever breaking a sweat. As the evening wound down, Maisie realized that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She wasn't just the pack's shame anymore. She was the girl the king chose to stand beside. But as she watched Lady Vane retreat into the shadows, she knew the noblewoman wouldn't forget the humiliation. The Alpha Games were no longer just a competition for physical prowess. They were becoming a battleground for her very survival. Bastian's protection was a shield, but it was also a target, and Maisie knew that she would have to be faster than she had ever been to stay ahead of the danger brewing in the dark. Chapter 13. The Scent of a Mate. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant musk of the forest. Maisie had retreated to the balcony of her quarters, needing a moment of quiet to process the chaos of the banquet. Her hands rested on the cold metal of the silver chariot's wheels, her mind replaying the way Bastian had looked at her when he defended her honor. It was more than just kindness. There was a gravity to his gaze that she couldn't explain. She had always heard stories about the fated mate bond, a mystical, soul-deep connection that shifters claimed could change a person's entire world in a single breath. She had always dismissed it as a romantic fairy tale designed to keep the pack compliant. A sudden, sharp tingling sensation started at the base of her spine, spreading through her body like a slow-burning fire. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was insistent, a pull that seemed to originate from somewhere deep inside her chest. She turned her chair toward the door, her heart beginning to race with an anticipation she didn't understand. A moment later, the door opened, and Bastian stepped into the room. He didn't look like a king tonight. He looked like a man who was struggling to maintain his composure. His scent hit her like a physical wave: cedar, rain-drenched earth, and a spicy metallic undertone that made her head swim. Bastian stopped in the center of the room, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. For years, Maisie's scent had been a quiet background note in the pack, smelling of metal, lavender soap, and the faint sweetness of the cookies she was always sneaking. But tonight, it felt amplified, a vibrant symphony of aromas that seemed to call out to him with an undeniable demand. He took a step toward her, his eyes changing from their usual stormy gray to a deep, glowing amber. The shift in his gaze was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He whispered a single word, the sound so low it was almost a growl. "Mate." Maisie felt the word vibrate through her very bones. She wanted to argue, to say that she wasn't a shifter and that she didn't have a wolf to answer his call. but her body was already betraying her. The pulling sensation in her chest intensified, urging her to move closer to him. She looked at him, her voice trembling slightly as she asked if he was sure. She pointed out that she was the girl who couldn't shift, the one the pack called broken. She told him that he was the Alpha King, and that he deserved a queen who could run beside him in the moonlight, not someone who relied on a chariot to cross the room. Bastian didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and dropped to his knees in front of her chair. He took her hands in his grip firm but incredibly gentle. He told her that his wolf didn't care about the shape of her legs or the mechanics of her movement. He said that his soul recognized hers from the moment she rammed into his shins and told him he was in a parking zone. He looked up at her, his amber eyes searching hers with a raw, bleeding honesty. He promised her that she was exactly what he had been searching for through a century of silence and duty. The reality of the bond settled over them, a warm and heavy blanket that seemed to drown out the rest of the world. For the first time in her life, Maisie felt truly seen, not as a tragedy, not as a hero, and not as a problem, but as a person who was fundamentally and irrevocably wanted. The humor that usually protected her felt small and insignificant in the face of such a massive truth. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed a lock of dark hair from his forehead. She told him that he was an idiot for choosing the most difficult girl in the kingdom, but she didn't tell him to leave. Bastian chuckled, the sound vibrating against her palms. He told her that he had always enjoyed a challenge, and that difficult was just another word for magnificent. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and they sat in silence for a long time, letting the bond knit itself together. The air in the room felt different now, charged with a new, permanent energy. They were no longer 2 people playing a game of cat and mouse. They were 2 halves of a whole, tethered together by a fate that didn't care about the rules of the shifter world. But even as the warmth of the bond filled her, a cold prickle of reality touched Maisie's mind. If she was the king's mate, she was no longer just a girl in a chair. She was the future queen of the shifters. The pack elders would never accept her, and the noble women who had been vying for his attention would see her as a mortal enemy. She looked at Bastian and asked him what they were going to do. He pulled back slightly, his eyes still glowing with that fierce amber light. He told her that they were going to do exactly what they had been doing. They were going to win, and they were going to make the rest of the world try to keep up. Chapter 14. The Wheelie Herd, Round the World. The discovery of the mate bond had given Maisie a restless, jittery energy that she couldn't quite burn off. 2 days later, she found herself on the high terrace of the palace gardens, the full moon hanging like a massive pearl in the indigo sky. Bastian was with her, having insisted on a romantic walk that had mostly consisted of him walking at a brisk pace while she sped circles around him. The terrace was made of polished obsidian-style marble that was incredibly smooth, a dream for her wheels and a nightmare for anyone trying to maintain their dignity. The air was filled with the sound of the crickets and the distant howl of wolves celebrating the moon. Bastian was in a particularly festive mood, his usual stoicism replaced by a playful, relaxed energy. He had spent the last hour telling her ridiculous stories about his early years as an alpha, including a highly questionable incident involving a beehive and a stolen crown. Maisie was laughing so hard her sides ached, her hands gripping the wheels of the silver chariot as she did a series of tight spins around a marble statue. She told him that he was clearly a terrible influence on the youth of the kingdom, and that she was going to have to do a lot of damage control when she became queen. He stopped near the edge of a large ornamental koi pond, the water reflecting the moonlight in shimmering ripples. He looked at her, his eyes full of a heat that made her pulse jump, and told her that he had never seen her look so beautiful. He asked her to show him one of those stunts she was always bragging about. Maisie, never one to back down from a challenge, especially when fueled by adrenaline and a desire to impress her mate, decided that this was the perfect moment for a celebratory wheelie. She told him to prepare himself for the greatest display of athleticism in the history of the pack. She gripped the rims, took a deep breath, and shoved backward with all her strength before snapping her weight forward. The front casters of the silver chariot rose into the air with a satisfying clack. She held the balance point perfectly, spinning in a tight circle on her rear wheels, her laughter echoing across the terrace. For a few glorious seconds, she felt like she was flying. Bastian was cheering, his hands clapping in genuine appreciation. But then, disaster struck in the form of a rogue, slippery patch of moss that had grown near the edge of the pond. The left wheel hit the moss and lost its grip, sending the chair into an uncontrolled sideways slide. Maisie's eyes widened as she realized she was headed straight for the water. She tried to lean her weight in the opposite direction, but the momentum was too great. With a startled yelp, she and the silver chariot toppled over the edge of the stone embankment. There was a massive, wet splash that sounded like a cannon going off. The cold water closed over her head, shocking the air from her lungs as she sank toward the bottom of the shallow pond, the metal frame of her chair dragging her down. She barely had time to register the panic before a massive, dark shape plunged into the water beside her. Bastian didn't hesitate for a single second. He dove in, his powerful arms reaching through the murky water to find her. He grabbed her under the arms and hauled her toward the surface, his strength making the weight of the water feel like nothing. They broke the surface together, both of them gasping and coughing. The koi, clearly offended by the intrusion, scattered in a flash of orange and white scales. Bastian carried her to the edge of the pond, his expression a mixture of frantic worry and suppressed amusement. He lifted her out of the water and placed her on the dry stone, his expensive silk tunic clinging to his muscles like a second skin. He was dripping wet, his hair plastered to his face, and he looked like a drowned rat who had somehow managed to remain handsome. Maisie sat there, soaked to the bone, a strand of pondweed draped over her ear. She looked at him, then at the pond, and then back at him. A small, bubbly laugh escaped her lips, which quickly turned into a full-blown fit of hysterics. She told him that the silver chariot was now officially the silver submarine. Bastian stared at her for a heartbeat before he too began to roar with laughter. He sat down on the stone beside her, the water from his clothes forming a small puddle. He told her that she was the most chaotic creature in the world, and that he was never letting her near a body of water again without a life jacket. He reached out and pulled the pondweed from her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek. They sat there in the moonlight, two dripping, ridiculous mates. And Maisie realized that even when she was literally sinking, he was the one who would always dive in to catch her. Chapter 15. Not Your Average Luna. The laughter of the previous night was quickly replaced by the cold reality of pack politics. Word of the Koi Pond incident and the king's declaration of a mate bond had reached the Council of Elders, a group of ancient shifters who viewed tradition as more sacred than life itself. They had called for an emergency session in the High Chamber, a room filled with heavy oak furniture and the scent of old parchment. Maisie sat in her workshop-cleaned chair at the center of the room, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Bastian stood behind her, his hand resting firmly on the back of her seat, his presence a silent warning to anyone who dared to speak out. Elder Harek, a man whose face looked like a dried-up riverbed, stood up and cleared his throat with a sound like grinding stones. He began a long-winded speech about the purity of the bloodline and the necessity of a strong Luna to lead the pack into battle. He argued that the king's choice was a violation of the ancestral laws, claiming that a woman who could not shift could never truly understand the heart of the wolf. He spoke about Maisie as if she weren't in the room, calling her a sympathetic burden and a political liability that would weaken the king's standing among the other territories. The other elders nodded in agreement, their faces grim and judgmental. They weren't just attacking Maisie. They were trying to invalidate the mate bond itself, claiming that Bastian's judgment had been clouded by a passing fancy or a temporary insanity. Maisie felt the familiar spark of rebellion in her chest, but she remained silent, wanting to see how Bastian would handle the challenge. She knew that if she spoke up too soon, it would only prove their point about her being difficult. She watched Bastian's jaw tighten, the only outward sign of the fury that was brewing beneath his royal composure. Bastian stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't yell, and he didn't growl. Instead, he spoke with a voice that was so calm, it was chilling. He asked Elder Herrick if he remembered the rogue attack on the Western Nursery 12 years ago. The room went silent. Bastian recounted the story of the young girl who had stayed behind, the one who had used her body as a shield to protect the pack's future. He pointed out that while the strong warriors had been busy retreating to the forest, this broken girl had stood her ground. He told the council that if they wanted to talk about the heart of the wolf, they should start by looking at the only person in the room who had actually sacrificed everything for the pack. He declared that the mate bond was not a suggestion from the ancestors, but a command, and that he would not have his choice questioned by men who had spent the last decade hiding behind their desks. He told them that Maisie was not their average Luna, because she was better than any leader they had ever seen. He promised that if any of them continued to disrespect his mate, he would consider it an act of treason against the crown. The air in the chamber felt electric, the power of his alpha command forcing the elders to lower their heads in reluctant submission. Maisie looked up at Bastian, her heart swelling with a pride she hadn't expected to feel. He wasn't just defending her because they were mates. He was defending her because he truly believed in her. He saw the strength that she had tried to hide behind sarcasm and wheels, and he was making the rest of the world see it too. She realized then that she didn't have to change to be a queen. She just had to be the person who was brave enough to stand, or sit, against the tide. She reached back and squeezed his hand, a silent thank you that he acknowledged with a gentle pressure on her shoulder. The Council of Elders eventually dismissed the session, their faces sour as they retreated into the shadows. They hadn't been convinced, but they had been silenced, which was enough for now. As Maisie and Bastian left the chamber, she told him that he was a very dramatic man and that his speech was a bit much. Bastian laughed, the tension leaving his shoulders. He told her that he was just getting started, and that the Alpha Games would be the final proof the pack needed. He looked down at her with a wink and told her that she had a kingdom to run, and she'd better not be late for the opening ceremony. Chapter 16. The Secret Workshop. The rhythmic clanging of a hammer against glowing steel echoed through the damp corridors of the lower levels, a sound that usually belonged to the master blacksmith at the break of dawn. Maisie found herself drawn toward the heat of the royal forge, her curiosity piqued by the fact that the primary forge was supposed to be closed for the festival preparations. She maneuvered the silver chariot over the uneven stone floor, her silent wheels, thanks to Bastian's high-grade lubricant, allowing her to approach without announcing her presence. The air grew thick with the scent of charcoal and burnt ozone, a sharp contrast to the floral perfumes that had choked the ballroom only hours before. She rounded the final pillar and came to a sudden halt, her eyes widening at the sight before her. It wasn't the burly master blacksmith standing over the anvil. It was the Alpha King himself. Bastian had discarded his royal tunic, his broad shoulders and muscular back glistening with sweat under the orange glow of the furnace. He was working with a focus that bordered on the spiritual, his movements precise and powerful as he shaped a piece of lightweight, shimmering metal. He looked less like a king and more like a force of nature, a man who was as comfortable creating as he was commanding. Maisie watched in silence for a long moment, fascinated by the way his hands, which were capable of crushing stone, were currently handling the delicate curves of what looked like a frame. She cleared her throat, the sound small against the roar of the fire. She asked him if he had finally lost his mind, or if the royal treasury had run so dry that the king had to take up a side hustle in metallurgy. Bastian didn't startle. He simply finished his strike before setting the hammer aside and turning toward her. A slow, smoldering grin spread across his face, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the forge. He wiped his hands on a dark rag and walked toward her, the heat radiating off his skin in waves. He told her that he had found the designs for her chair to be woefully inefficient for the kind of speeds she liked to reach. He gestured toward the workbench, where a set of titanium spokes and a reinforced chassis lay in various stages of assembly. He explained that he had spent his youth learning the craft from the mountain elders, and that he wanted to ensure her next chariot was worthy of the woman who intended to outrun him. The sheer sincerity in his voice made the air in the room feel even hotter. Maisie felt a strange fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She told him that he was being incredibly overbearing and that she hadn't given him permission to tinker with her lifestyle. But even as the sarcasm left her lips, she found herself rolling closer to the workbench to inspect his handiwork. The welds were perfect, the lines aerodynamic and sleek. He had even incorporated a small, hidden lever that she suspected was for a braking system she hadn't yet dreamed of. He wasn't just building a chair, he was building a masterpiece of engineering that respected her independence. Bastian leaned against the stone table, his proximity making Maisie's pulse do a frantic little dance. He told her that he didn't want to change her, but he did want to give her the best tools to be herself. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray smudge of charcoal from her forehead, his touch lingering long enough to send a shiver down her spine. He whispered that a queen of the wolves should have a ride that made the wind jealous. Maisie looked at the metal, and then up at the man who had spent his night sweating over a furnace just for her. She realized that his love wasn't a cage. It was a pair of wings. The moment was interrupted by the cooling of the metal, a sharp hiss as it settled into its new shape. Maisie told him that his craftsmanship was adequate, but that he should probably stick to his day job before the blacksmith sued him for copyright infringement. Bastian laughed, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to fill the small space. He promised her that once the chair was finished, he would expect a formal race to test its capabilities. As she turned to leave, her heart felt heavier and lighter all at once. She was falling for the Alpha King, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop. Chapter 17. The Rogue Rumors. The peaceful atmosphere of the Citadel was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of a blood-stained scout from the eastern borders. The news was grim. A coordinated group of rogue wolves, outcasts who had refused to acknowledge the king's authority, were moving through the mountain passes. They weren't just raiding for food. They were looking for a way to destabilize the Alpha convergence. In the strategic meetings that followed, a chilling detail emerged. The rogues had been seen watching the palace gates, specifically focusing on the weakest points of the pack's defense. To a group of ruthless predators, the girl in the wheelchair was the ultimate target. Maisie sat in the corner of the war room, her presence largely ignored by the high-ranking generals who were busy shouting over maps. She listened to their dismissive comments about how she would need to be moved to the deep bunkers for her own safety. They spoke as if she were a piece of furniture that needed to be tucked away until the storm passed. One particularly arrogant commander remarked that a wolf without legs was nothing more than a liability during a siege. Maisie's hands tightened on her wheels, her eyes flashing with a cold, focused anger. She wasn't a liability. She was the only one who knew every secret passage and blind spot in the fortress. Bastian sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he listened to his men. He didn't look at Maisie, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. He finally silenced the room with a single sharp clap of his hands. He told his commanders that the rogues were likely banking on the pack's own prejudices. He pointed out that the enemy would expect the crippled girl to be hidden and defenseless. A dark, calculating smile touched his lips as he suggested that perhaps they should give the rogues exactly what they wanted, a target that wasn't nearly as helpless as she appeared. After the meeting adjourned, Bastian caught up with Maisie in the hallway. He told her that he knew she wouldn't stay in the bunkers even if he chained her there, He asked her if she was willing to play the part of the bait, to lure the rogue scouts into a trap within the palace walls. Maisie gave him a sharp, toothy grin and told him that she had been playing the part of the helpless victim for 12 years and was getting quite bored with the role. She suggested that they use the service corridors, places where the larger, bulkier wolves would find it difficult to maneuver, but where the silver chariot could move like a lightning bolt. The plan was dangerous, and the risk of the rogues catching her was real, but Maisie felt a surge of adrenaline at the thought of finally fighting back. She spent the afternoon coordinating with Pip, setting up accidents in the narrowest hallways. They rigged tripwires made of high-tension fishing line and placed slick patches of oil near the sharpest turns. She was turning the palace into a giant, lethal maze where she was the only one who knew the exit. She felt a strange sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a strategist. As night fell, the citadel went into a state of silent lockdown. The guards were pulled back from the inner corridors, leaving the hallways looking empty and vulnerable. Maisie sat in the center of the great hall, her silhouette visible against the moonlight streaming through the high windows. She looked like a lonely, abandoned figure, a perfect prize for a group of hungry rogues. She could hear the faint scratching of claws against stone, the sound of the intruders entering through the laundry chutes she had left, accidentally, unsecured. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the wheels. A low growl echoed from the shadows, and 3 massive scarred wolves emerged into the light. Their eyes were yellow with hunger and malice, their fur matted with the grime of the wilderness. They looked at Maisie and saw an easy kill, a way to hurt the king and prove their dominance. Maisie didn't scream, and she didn't beg. She simply popped a small wheelie, gave them a cheeky wink, and told them that they were trespassing in a no-entry zone. She spun the silver chariot around and took off at a speed that made the rogues blink in surprise. The chase was on, but the predators had no idea they were the ones being hunted. Chapter 18. The High-Speed Heist. The rogues scrambled after her, their heavy paws sliding on the polished marble as they tried to match her sudden burst of speed. Maisie didn't head for the open courtyards. She veered sharply into the servant tunnels, a network of narrow, low-ceilinged passages that felt like a cage to the massive wolves. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her hands a blur as she navigated the tight corners. The first rogue tried to lung at her, but she performed a sharp J-turn that sent him crashing into a stone pillar. She laughed over her shoulder, telling him that he should have taken a navigation course before trying to follow a professional. The second rogue was smarter, staying low to the ground and trying to cut her off at a junction. Maisie saw him coming and reached for a small cord she had hidden under her seat. As she passed the junction, she yanked the cord, releasing a stack of heavy iron frying pans she had precariously balanced on a shelf above. The resulting clatter was deafening, and the wolf was buried under a pile of kitchenware that left him dazed and howling in confusion. Maisie didn't slow down, her wheels spinning faster as she headed toward the steep ramp that led to the laundry facilities. She could hear the third rogue, the leader, close behind her. He was faster and more determined than the others, his breath hot against the back of her chair. Maisie knew she couldn't outrun him forever on a straight path. She headed for the silver slide, the long, smooth wooden ramp she had used during her escape from the king. She shoved herself forward, the wind whistling past her ears as she gained momentum. The rogue leaped after her, his claws extended, but he didn't account for the slick patch of industrial soap Maisie had smeared across the middle of the ramp. The wolf hit the soap and lost all traction, his legs splaying out in 4 different directions as he became a furry projectile. He bypassed Maisie entirely, sliding past her with a look of pure terror, before crashing into a massive pile of wet linens at the bottom. Maisie used her brakes to slow her descent, coming to a controlled stop just a few feet away from the struggling wolf. She looked at him, entangled in a dozen bedsheets and smelling of lavender, and told him that he looked much better in floral prints. The rogue snarled, but he was so wrapped up in the heavy fabric that he couldn't even stand. She realized then that the heist the rogues had planned was a complete failure. They had come for a victim and found a nightmare. Maisie didn't wait for them to recover. She blew a small silver whistle that signaled the hidden guards. Within seconds, the hallway was swarming with Bastion's elite warriors, who made quick work of the incapacitated intruders. Maisie sat in her chair, watching the scene with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had defended her home, used her disability as a weapon, and proved that the smartest wolf in the pack didn't need 4 legs to win a fight. As the guards hauled the rogues away, Bastion emerged from the shadows at the top of the ramp. He looked down at the chaos, his eyes moving from the pile of frying pans to the laundry-wrapped leader, and finally, to Maisie. He walked down the ramp, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. He simply reached out and pulled her into a fierce, bone-crushing hug. He smelled of rain and relief, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against her cheek. He told her that he had never been so terrified and so incredibly proud in his entire life. Maisie leaned into his warmth, the adrenaline finally starting to fade and leaving her limbs feeling like lead. She told him that he was getting her hair messy and that he owed her a very large plate of lemon tarts for her service to the crown. Bastion laughed, his grip tightening for a moment before he pulled back to look at her. He told her that he would give her the entire bakery if she wanted it. But as they stood there in the quiet of the laundry room, Maisie noticed a sharp, metallic snap. She looked down and saw that one of the spokes on her wheel had finally buckled under the pressure of the chase. Chapter 19. The King's Fury. The sight of the broken spoke sent a jolt of vulnerability through Maisie that she wasn't prepared for. It was a small thing, a single piece of metal, but it represented the fragile line between her independence and her helplessness. Bastion noticed it immediately, his eyes darkening with a flash of protective fury that made the air in the room turn cold. He looked at the damaged wheel and then at the captured rogues, his inner wolf snarling at the fact that they had dared to make his mate feel even a second of instability. He turned to his commander and ordered the rogues to be taken to the deepest cells, his voice carrying a promise of retribution that made even the guards flinch. He turned back to Maisie, his expression softening instantly, though the fire was still lingering in his gaze. He told her that he was going to carry her back to her quarters, and this time, he wasn't asking for permission. Maisie started to argue, her pride rearing its head, but she realized that the silver chariot was genuinely unsafe to drive. She let out a frustrated sigh and held up her arms, telling him that if he dropped her, she would make sure he spent the rest of his life sleeping in the stables. Bastion didn't hesitate, scooping her up with an ease that reminded her of his immense strength. The walk back to her rooms was silent, the palace echoing with the aftermath of the skirmish. Maisie rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady thrum of his heart. She felt a strange sense of peace in his arms, a feeling of being protected without being smothered. She realized that she didn't have to be a one-woman army all the time. Sometimes, it was okay to let someone else carry the weight. Bastion carried her all the way to her bed, placing her down as if she were made of the finest glass. He stayed with her, kneeling on the floor beside the bed, his hand never leaving hers. He told her that the rogues had been working for a larger faction, one that wanted to stop the coronation. He said that they saw her as a weakness because they didn't understand that she was his greatest strength. He promised her that he would spend every waking moment ensuring that no one ever laid a hand on her again. The intensity in his voice was overwhelming, a raw and honest declaration of his devotion. Maisie felt a tear prick at her eye, a rare display of emotion that she quickly tried to blink away. She told him that he was being overly dramatic again and that she just needed a nap. Bastion didn't leave. He waited until she fell into a restless sleep, his presence a silent sentinel in the dark room. He spent the night thinking about the upcoming coronation and the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. He knew that the pack elders were still plotting, and that the rogues were just the beginning. He realized that to truly protect Maisie, he couldn't just build her a better chair or hide her in a bunker. He had to change the world they lived in. He had to make sure that the Black Ridge Pack became a place where a girl in a wheelchair was seen as a queen, not a victim. When Maisie woke up the next morning, she found a new chair sitting by her bed. It wasn't the titanium one Bastion had been working on. It was her old silver chariot, but every single part had been replaced with high-grade materials. The broken spoke was gone, replaced by a gleaming piece of reinforced steel. There was a note on the seat that simply said, "The chariot is ready for the final race. I'll be waiting at the finish line." Maisie ran her hand over the smooth metal, feeling the love that had gone into the repairs. She realized that she wasn't just a girl in a chair anymore. She was a woman with a king by her side. She looked out the window at the rising sun, the citadel glowing in the morning light. The Alpha Games were over, but the real challenge was just beginning. She knew that the coronation would be the moment of truth, the day she would have to stand, or sit, before the entire shifter world and claim her place. She felt a surge of determination, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't going to let the elders or the rogues take away the life she was starting to build. She gripped the wheels of the restored silver chariot and prepared to face the day, her mind already working on her next move. Chapter 20. The Broken Spoke. The morning of the coronation arrived with a clear blue sky and a sense of heavy anticipation that hung over the citadel like a shroud. The Grand Plaza was filled with thousands of shifters from every corner of the continent, their scents mingling in a chaotic, vibrant soup of excitement and tension. Maisie sat in her room, staring at the royal gown that had been laid out for her. It was a masterpiece of silver silk and deep blue velvet, designed to complement the colors of the king's house. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, the weight of the upcoming ceremony pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at the silver chariot, which was gleaming under the sunlight. Bastion had even added a small royal crest to the backrest, a gesture that made her smile despite her nerves. She knew that the elders would be watching her every move, looking for any sign of weakness or hesitation. She knew that the crowd would be judging her, wondering how a woman who couldn't shift could lead a nation of predators. She took a deep breath, telling herself that she had faced rogues and laundry chutes and had survived them all. A coronation was just another obstacle course, and she was the best driver in the business. Pip arrived to help her with the final details, his hands shaking as he adjusted the silver pins in her hair. He told her that she looked like a goddess, and that the king was going to fall over when he saw her. Maisie laughed, telling him that she hoped he didn't fall over because she didn't want to have to pick him up while wearing a velvet gown. They shared a moment of quiet camaraderie, the kind of bond that only comes from years of being the underdogs together. Pip looked at her and said that no matter what happened out there, she would always be the fastest wolf in his heart. As the horn signaled the start of the ceremony, Maisie began her journey toward the plaza. She moved through the hallways with a regal grace, her wheels silent against the stone. She could hear the roar of the crowd in the distance, a sound that felt like a physical wave. She reached the grand doors that led to the dais and stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at her hands and noticed a small hairline fracture in the frame of her chair, a lingering injury from the rogue attack that had gone unnoticed during the repairs. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. If the frame gave way during her entrance, she would be humiliated in front of the entire world. She would prove the elders right, and she would become the tragedy they always wanted her to be. She felt a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, her confidence crumbling like dry leaves. She looked at the door, her hand reaching for the wheels to turn back, to run away from the pressure and the judgment. But then, she felt a familiar scent fill the air, cedar and rain. Bastion was standing on the other side of the door, waiting for her. She remembered his promise, his eyes in the forge, and the way he had looked at her in the laundry room. She realized that she wasn't doing this for the elders or the pack. She was doing it for herself and for the man who believed she could fly. She straightened her back, her eyes narrowing with a sudden fierce resolve. If the chair broke, she would crawl. If she fell, she would get back up. She wasn't going to let a small crack in a piece of metal define her destiny. She signaled the guards to open the doors, the sunlight blinding her for a second as she moved into the light. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that vibrated in her chest. She moved down the long paved aisle, her eyes fixed on the man standing at the far end. Bastian was dressed in his full royal regalia, his crown gleaming under the sun, but his eyes were only for her. He looked at her with a pride that was so intense it was almost tangible. Maisie felt the frame of her chair groan under her weight, a warning of the impending failure, but she didn't slow down. She reached the base of the dais and prepared for the final ascent, the cliffhanger of her life hanging by a single broken thread of metal. Chapter 21. The Paved Path. The grand plaza of the granite citadel was a sea of fur, silk, and bated breath. Thousands of eyes were pinned on Maisie as she reached the first tier of the royal dais. The sun glinted off the silver embroidery of her gown, but her mind was entirely focused on the sickening groan of the metal beneath her. That hairline fracture in the frame of the silver chariot felt like a ticking time bomb, vibrating with every rotation of her wheels. She could feel the unevenness of the stone tiles beneath her, each small bump threatening to turn the fracture into a total collapse. The silence was so absolute that she feared the entire pack could hear the metal straining against her weight, mocking her attempt at a royal entrance. Bastian stood at the very top of the stairs, looking down at her with an intensity that burned through the morning chill. He could see the slight tension in her jaw and the way her knuckles had turned white against the rims. He knew her well enough by now to realize that something was wrong, yet he didn't rush down to swoop her up. He understood that to do so now, in front of the gathered territories, would be to strip her of the victory she had fought so hard to claim. He stayed his ground, his hands folded behind his back, but his amber eyes never left hers. He was a silent anchor in a world that was waiting for her to fail. As she reached the steepest part of the ramp that had been specially constructed for the day, the metal finally gave a sharp, metallic ping. The chair lurched to the left, the frame sagging dangerously toward the ground. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and a few of the elders in the front row leaned forward with expressions of poorly hidden satisfaction. They were waiting for the tragedy, for the moment the broken girl would finally succumb to the reality of her limitations. Maisie felt the panic clawing at her throat, but she refused to let it take hold. She shifted her weight, balancing the chair on its one stable side with a precision that only years of struggle could have taught her. She looked up at Bastian, a silent challenge in her eyes. She wasn't asking for help. She was telling him to watch. With a grunt of effort that strained the muscles in her arms, she shoved the wheels forward, using the momentum to carry her over the most precarious section of the climb. The frame groaned again, louder this time, but she didn't slow down. She moved with a defiant, reckless grace that made the breath of the onlookers hitch. She reached the top of the dais, the silver chariot coming to a halt just inches away from the king's boots. The metal was bent, the frame was ruined, but she was exactly where she was meant to be. Bastian reached out, taking her hands in his. He didn't look at the damaged chair. He only looked at the woman who had just conquered the impossible. He leaned down, his voice a low, private rumble that didn't carry to the crowds below. He told her that he had never seen anything as beautiful as her refusal to break when the world demanded it. He said that the path behind her might have been difficult, but the path ahead of them was going to be paved with whatever she required. The heat in his gaze was enough to make her forget the thousands of people watching them. She felt the weight of his respect, a foundation more solid than any metal frame. He turned to face the assembly, his voice booming across the plaza with the force of a thunderclap. He didn't introduce her as a victim of fate or a ward of the crown. He announced to the four corners of the shifter world that Maisie was the queen they had been waiting for, a leader who didn't need a wolf's form to show the heart of a predator. He declared that the old laws of physical perfection were dead, replaced by a new era where spirit and resilience would be the only measure of worth. The crowd remained silent for a heartbeat before a roar of approval began to build, starting with the scouts she had befriended and spreading until the very mountains seemed to shake. Maisie sat tall, her fingers intertwined with the king's. She looked out over the pack that had once tried to forget her name and felt a strange sense of peace. She had reached the finish line of her old life, but as she felt the strength of Bastion's grip, she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger race. The elders were already retreating into the shadows, their power over her broken forever. She gave a small, triumphant smile to the crowd, the sunlight catching the silver crest on her chair. She was no longer a ghost in the machinery. She was the architect of the future, and the world was finally ready to follow her lead. Chapter 22. The Queen's Gambit. The official coronation was not a simple affair of crowns and oaths. In the Black Ridge Pack, it was a ceremony of acceptance, where the new Luna had to stand before the high altar and receive the blessing of the pack's spirit. The Council of Elders sat in a semicircle around the altar, their faces like carved masks of disapproval. Elder Herrick, the most vocal of the detractors, stood up as the final prayers were concluded. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the silver chariot and stated that while the king had made his choice, the traditions of their ancestors demanded a test of strength. He argued that a queen must be able to protect the pack in its darkest hour, and he challenged Maisie to prove she was more than just a clever girl with wheels. Bastion's hand moved toward the hilt of his ceremonial blade, his inner wolf snarling at the blatant insult, but Maisie placed a calming hand on his arm. She wasn't going to let him fight this battle for her. She rolled her chair into the center of the circle, looking at each of the elders with a level of confidence that made them shift uncomfortably in their seats. She told them that they had spent decades confusing physical dominance with true strength. She remarked that a wolf could be strong of limb, but weak of mind, and that the history of their pack was littered with perfect warriors who had failed because they lacked the vision to see beyond the next hunt. She threw down her own challenge, a gamble that made even Bastion blink in surprise. She told the council that she would accept the crown only on one condition: that the Alpha Run, the traditional race through the forest to celebrate a new reign, be opened to everyone in the pack, regardless of their ability to shift. She proposed that if she could reach the ancient standing stones at the center of the woods before the elders' chosen champion, the council would dissolve their right to veto any of her future decrees. It was a bold, dangerous move that put her entire future on the line in a single afternoon. The elders whispered among themselves, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of an easy victory. They believed that on the forest floor, away from the smooth marble of the palace, Maisie would be at a total disadvantage. They accepted the terms, naming the fastest young alpha in the pack as their champion. Bastion looked at Maisie, his expression a mixture of terror and admiration. He asked her if she realized that the forest path was a labyrinth of roots and mud. She gave him a cheeky wink and told him that she had spent the last week working with Pip on a secret project that was going to make the elders regret every word they had spoken. As the pack gathered at the edge of the woods for the start of the race, Maisie revealed her secret weapon. She wasn't using the silver chariot for this journey. Instead, she was seated in the lightweight titanium frame that Bastion had forged in the secret workshop, but with a series of modifications that only Pip could have devised. The wheels were wider, covered in a high-traction rubber that could grip the slipperiest of moss, and the frame had a sophisticated suspension system that allowed her to absorb the shocks of the uneven terrain. She looked like a warrior in a futuristic battle carriage, ready to take on the wilderness itself. The horn sounded, and the alpha champion took off into the trees. a blur of gray fur and raw speed. Maisie didn't try to match his initial burst. She knew the forest better than any of them. She headed for the paved path, the series of old logging roads and smooth stone ridges that she had mapped out during her years of solitude. She moved with a focused intensity, her arms working in perfect harmony with the new mechanics of her chair. She bypassed the mud pits and the tangled thickets that slowed the wolf down, using her knowledge of the geography to find the most efficient route toward the standing stones. Bastian ran beside her, not as a participant, but as a guardian. He watched in awe as she navigated the descent of a rocky ridge, using her brakes to control her speed with the precision of a master pilot. She wasn't just surviving the forest, she was conquering it. The alpha champion was fast, but he was also arrogant, assuming he could simply overpower the terrain. He got caught in a patch of deep brambles that Maisie bypassed by taking a slightly longer but much faster route over the high ground. By the time they reached the final stretch, Maisie was in the lead, her breath coming in sharp, steady gasps. She reached the ancient standing stones just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the orange light bathing the clearing in a golden glow. She slammed her hand against the central stone, signaling her victory. The alpha champion emerged from the trees seconds later, his fur matted with burrs and his tongue lolling out in exhaustion. He looked at the girl in the chair and let out a whine of reluctant respect. The elders, who had followed at a slower pace, arrived to find their broken queen standing victorious in the heart of their most sacred ground. The gamble had paid off, and the kingdom was finally hers. Chapter 23. The Coronation Race. The victory in the forest had changed everything. The whispers of dissent had been replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect that followed Maisie wherever she went. The day of the formal coronation parade arrived, and the entire kingdom was invited to witness the new era of the Black Ridge Pack. But instead of the traditional somber procession through the streets of the capital, Maisie had planned something entirely different. She called it the Coronation Race, a high-speed tour of the city where the citizens could see their new king and queen in action. She wanted to show them that her reign wouldn't be lived from a throne room, but from the front lines of the people's lives. Bastian was dressed in his royal armor, his dark hair wind-blown and his eyes bright with excitement. He was standing next to Maisie, who was seated in her newly christened royal chariot, the titanium frame now painted in a deep shimmering silver with gold accents. She had discarded the heavy velvet gown for a more practical set of leathers that allowed her full range of motion. The streets were lined with thousands of people, their cheers creating a wall of sound that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The energy in the air was electric, a far cry from the stiff, formal atmosphere of the previous ceremonies. The race began at the palace gates and wound its way through the lower markets, the residential districts, and finally up the long, winding road to the High Temple. Maisie took the lead, her wheels humming against the cobblestones with a satisfying, rhythmic vibration. She didn't hold back, pushing herself to the limit as she wove through the cheering crowds. Bastian ran alongside her, his powerful strides matching the rotations of her wheels. They moved as a single unit, a perfect blend of shifter power and human ingenuity. It was a visual representation of the partnership that would define their rule, a sight that moved many to tears. As they reached the market district, Maisie performed a series of daring maneuvers, spinning her chair around tight corners and waving to the children who were perched on their parents' shoulders. She was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows. She was the light of the kingdom, a beacon of possibility for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. She saw the faces of the other unworthy wolves, the elderly, the injured, the ones who had been cast aside, and she saw the hope blooming in their eyes. She realized that her crown wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a promise of a better life for all of them. Bastian watched her with a pride that he couldn't hide. He saw the way the people looked at her, and he knew that he had made the right choice. He didn't want a queen who would just sit beside him. He wanted a partner who would push him to be a better man. He found himself laughing as he tried to keep up with her during a particularly fast stretch of the road, the joy of the moment washing away the years of royal burden. He felt more like a king in this moment, running through the streets with his mate, than he ever had sitting on the throne of granite. The race concluded at the High Temple, where the entire pack was waiting to take their final vows of loyalty. Maisie and Bastian reached the summit together, their breath synchronized and their hearts beating as one. They stood and sat before the altar, their hands joined as they swore to protect the pack and to lead with wisdom and compassion. The ceremony was simple, but the weight of it was profound. The elders stood in the background, their influence finally faded to nothing. The new era had officially begun, and it was a world where the speed of one's spirit was the only thing that mattered. As the sun set on the day of their coronation, Maisie and Bastian stood on the balcony of the temple, looking out over the glowing lights of the city. The celebration was still going on below, the sounds of music and laughter drifting up to them on the evening breeze. Maisie felt the warmth of Bastian's hand on her shoulder, a steady presence that gave her the strength to face whatever challenges the future might bring. She knew that there would be more races to run and more obstacles to overcome, but she also knew that she would never have to do it alone. The "Catch Me If You Can" challenge was over, but the journey was just beginning. Chapter 24. Happily Ever After, with Speed Bumps. A year had passed since the coronation, and the granite citadel had undergone a transformation that mirrored the change in the pack's heart. The steep, narrow staircases had been replaced by wide, elegant ramps of smooth stone, and the inaccessible corners of the fortress were now the most vibrant parts of the palace. Maisie sat in her private garden, the silver chariot, now a refined blend of her original manual chair and Bastian's titanium upgrades, resting on the level patio. She was busy reading a series of reports from the newly established vocational schools, where shifters of all abilities were learning the crafts that Bastian and Pip had championed. The kingdom was thriving, the old prejudices fading into the past as the people realized that their diversity was their greatest strength. Maisie had become more than just a queen. She was a legend, the woman who had redefined what it meant to be a wolf. She still had her sarcastic edge, and she still enjoyed, accidentally, running over the toes of anyone who tried to be too formal with her. But there was a new softness in her eyes whenever she looked at her people. She had found her place in the world, not by changing who she was, but by forcing the world to see her clearly. Bastian emerged from the palace, looking a bit harried after a long morning of diplomatic meetings with the northern territories. He had traded his royal furs for a simple tunic, his hair messy and his eyes searching for his mate. He found her in the garden and immediately let out a sigh of relief, the tension leaving his shoulders as he sat on the stone bench beside her. He told her that the Northern Alpha was still trying to understand why she had insisted on building a high-speed wheelchair racing track in the middle of the ceremonial hunting grounds. Maisie just gave him a smug grin and told him that the Northern Alpha lacked imagination. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar calluses on her palms. He told her that he had a surprise for her, something to celebrate their first anniversary as king and queen. He led her toward the edge of the palace walls, where a new, perfectly paved road stretched out into the distance, winding through the valley like a ribbon of silver. He explained that he had ordered the road to be built so that they could travel across the entire kingdom without ever hitting a single bump. It was a grand, romantic gesture that was perfectly Bastian, a mix of royal power and a deep, intuitive understanding of her needs. Maisie looked at the road, and then up at the man who had spent a year making sure the world was ready for her. She felt the familiar warmth of the mate bond, a steady thrum of love and gratitude that had only grown stronger with time. She told him that he was becoming dangerously sentimental in his old age, and that she was going to have to work twice as hard to keep him grounded. Bastian laughed, pulling her into a gentle, lingering kiss that tasted of pine and home. He whispered that he didn't mind being sentimental as long as he was doing it with her. She gripped the wheels of the silver chariot, a mischievous spark lighting up her eyes as she looked down the long, inviting stretch of the new road. She told him that the road looked like a perfect place for a test drive, and that she was feeling a bit restless after sitting in meetings all morning. She popped a wheelie, her hair catching the afternoon sun, and tossed a wink over her shoulder at the most powerful man in the world. She threw down the challenge that had started it all, her voice full of a wild, joyful energy. She told him that he was still a bit slow on the uptake, and that he should catch her if he could. Bastian's eyes darkened with a playful, predatory glint, his inner wolf surging to the surface in a burst of pure affection. He took off his coat, rolling up his sleeves as he prepared to run. He didn't move immediately, instead letting her get a healthy head start as she zoomed down the silver road, her laughter echoing back to him like a melody. He stood there for a heartbeat, a man who had everything he ever wanted, and whispered the words into the wind, a promise that would last 1,000 lifetimes. He told the empty air to have her repeat that again, because he was going to make sure that catching her was the best part of every day they spent together.